So I think we can start. Good morning to everyone. I'm very happy and excited to give our welcome to Professor Giacomo Gambaro and also to Professor Gaetano Rametta that is here with us too, and maybe will intervene during the debate later on. Few words about Giacomo Gambaro. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Padua, and his work mainly focuses on three different areas and topics. The first one is a transcendental philosophy tradition, particularly with a focus on Fichte theory. The second point, the second area of his research is neo-Kantian debate with a focus on Emil Lask's thoughts. And the third area, the third point of his research is political theory. And in particular, his research focuses about Antonio Gramsci, political theory. Today is the frontman for a larger group of scholars that is called Metamorphosis of Transcendental, that is trying in Padova since few years to connect theoretical reflection with practical and political issues of our contemporaneity, such as the ecological crisis, for example. And today is also a very important day because the new book of Professor Giacomo Gambaro is being released in Italy. It's a book dedicated to Emil Lask theory. So we can celebrate that too today. And I'll immediately handle it over to Professor Gambaro, and we can talk together later on in the debate time. So thank you very much. And thank you to Professor Gambaro to have accepted our invitation.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me today. I'm honored to be here at the Center for Advanced Studies. And I'm also very happy of this opportunity to share with you some significant results achieved by the research group, Metamorphosis of the Transcendental, of the University of Padua. As I will explain our main topics, our main research lines concern the transcendental philosophy, its history, its turns, its metamorphosis, but also its relevance today in the contemporaneity. In recent years, our research has been oriented towards one of the most important issues of our contemporaneity, namely the ecological crisis and the challenge of conceiving a politics that is up to the problems of the present. My talk aims to explain our idea of a new concept of politics, that is politics as jurisprudence. I decided to read you the text of my talk entitled Transcendental Philosophy and Ecology, Politics as Jurisprudence. I would like to share my screen so that you can better understand the steps of my speech. So, can you see the text? Perfect.
Yes.
So I will read this text. Tell me if I read too slow or too fast. Let's start. Transcendental Philosophy and Ecology, Politics as Jurisprudence. My talk aims to share with you some significant results achieved in recent years by the research group Metamorphosis of the Transcendental at the University of Padua, of which I am a member. I have decided to organize the talk as follows. First of all, I will try to briefly present what the objective of our group consists of. Then I will offer a definition of transcendental philosophy, trying to highlight its intrinsically ecological and environmental vocation. Finally, moving from the definition of the transcendental as ecological philosophy, I will attempt to explain some of the most important assumptions of our idea of the political problem in the time of ecological crisis. As you can see, as you can understand from the title of the paper, our idea concerns the possibility of delineating a politics as jurisprudence, that is a political practice based on an ecological use of law that escapes the logic of modern political science and 20th century political philosophy. As I will illustrate with the concept of jurisprudence, our group seeks to make many contemporary ecological struggles intelligible. These struggles are characterized on the one hand by punctual disputes that take place in specific local contexts and are carried out by contextual alliances, and on the other hand by the decisive intervention of courts and tribunals whose rulings support the battle for the environment without involving traditional political actors such as parties and institutions of political representation. Well, let's begin with the presentation of our group and its main lines of research. Metamorphosis of the Transcendental is a research group led by Professor Gaetano Rametta and composed of many scholars dealing with the history of transcendental philosophy. The interest in the history of philosophy, however, should not be misunderstood. The objective of our group does not consist only in the deepening of figures and moments of the past, but interacts with the history of philosophy in order to interrogate contemporaneity. In this regard, our main points of reference are philosophers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, such as Immanuel Kant and Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the philosophical traditions of the first half of the 20th century, such as the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl and the neo-Kantianism of Emil Lask, finally the thought of the last great exponents of the transcendental philosophy in the 20th century, such as Gilles Deleuze, a philosopher who is very relevant for us in the political field, since he coined the concept of jurisprudence that I will explain later. Well, what do all the names I've just mentioned have in common? What does Kant have in common with Husserl, for example, or Fichte with Deleuze? In short, the elements that link a large part of the exponent of transcendental philosophy and that in many ways constitute the fundamental features of the transcendental as such are two. First of all, the conception of philosophy as the practice of creating concepts. Secondly, the role of reflection on conditions of possibility. On the basis of a definition offered by Gilles Deleuze, philosophy, unlike scientific disciplines, is characterized by being a practice, and more precisely, in the creation of concepts. Transcendental philosophy, then, is philosophy insofar as it creates concepts which are not copies or representations of reality, but those specific instruments through which philosophy intervenes in reality. Unlike other traditions of thought, however, the philosophical practice of the transcendental is characterized by an additional feature. On the one hand, it creates concepts. On the other hand, it reflects on the conditions that make such a creation possible. The productive and creative issue is constantly connected to the reflective one in order to reconstruct the so-called conditions of possibility of thought. That is, all those elements that underlie the philosophical practice and make it possible. Starting from this mutual implication between concepts and conditions of possibility, it is also possible to introduce another fundamental assumption that distinguishes the perspective of our research group on the metamorphosis of the transcendental. In this regard, it is necessary to focus on the reflection on the conditions of possibility and its implication that, as I will try to explain, will already lead us to the problem of ecology or of the transcendental as ecological philosophy. In the history of transcendental philosophy, it is precisely at the level of the reconstruction of the conditions of possibility that an authentic metamorphosis takes place, a sort of turn that begins with the last Fichte and continues until the second half of the 20th century with Deleuze's post-structuralist approach. This metamorphosis consists in a fundamental acquisition. The subject of thought does not hold any primacy, but is determined through the removal and concealment of relationships, circumstances, preconditions, the conditions of possibility, precisely, that allow him to think. The subject, therefore, is never a principle of itself. It cannot claim to be autonomous or self-sufficient. And for transcendental philosophy, it is exactly this experience of disobjectivation, this experience of decentralization of the subject that occurs first and foremost in the very exercise of thought. Fichte, for example, introduces the concept of an original life that underlies the subject and that the subject through reflection can recognize as its own condition of possibility. Husserl treats the word of life and the passive synthesis as an indispensable horizon for having experience. Sartre formulates the concept of the impersonal field that makes possible every activity of our consciousness and that has nothing to do with our I. Deleuze, finally, coins the notion of plane of immanence, where there is no subject, but only impersonal flows and molecular connections. In short, for transcendental philosophy, to think always means to experience a radical desubjectivation. The search for the conditions of possibility forces us to deal with a dimension that precedes the subject, with a set of conditions, relationships, cases, and circumstances on which every activity and every existence depends. On the basis of this acquisition, we can understand why, in our opinion, the transcendental constitutes, as such, an ecological and environmental philosophy based on the deconstruction of the primacy of the subject and on the consequent overcoming of the dualism between subject and object, between I and world. Indeed, the idea that thought depends on conditions that can be grasped only through the dismissal of any transcendence of the subject indicates an intrinsically environmental perspective. Once the hierarchy between subject and object has been demystified, the reflection on the conditions of possibility is transformed into the reconstructions of the set of circumstances, cases, and context that constitutes the environment on which every life depends. What I've just argued about transcendental philosophy as ecological philosophy is crucial in order to introduce our current research on politics as jurisprudence. From the beginning, our attempt has been to offer a political translation of transcendental philosophy able to face the scenario of the dramatic ecological crisis, and above all, to offer some tools to read the new forms of politics in the time of the so-called Anthropocene. As you know, this expression, Anthropocene, was introduced in 2000 by the Dutch Nobel Prize-winning chemist Paul J. Crutzen in order to indicate the current geological era, characterized by the devastating effects of human action on the Earth's environment from the physical, chemical, and biological point of view. Global warming, the depletion of material resources and the livelihoods, floods, and other terrible natural disasters, as well as the destruction of ecosystems essential to the reproduction of life on the planet, and the spread of unprecedented epidemics, such as the COVID-19 pandemic itself. These are just some of the terrible effects of the ecological crisis caused by the anthropogenic impact. Faced with this dramatic scenario, it is, in our opinion, necessary that philosophy also offers its contribution, trying to elaborate keys to interact with new phenomena and to intervene in an increasingly complex world. Unlike other theoretical perspectives, however, we have always been convinced of one fact: the radically political nature of the ecological crisis. Interacting with the contemporary scenario then means for us to bring out the political, historically, and socio-economically determined metrics of the Anthropocene era. The Anthropocene is not the product of a humanity conceived in a generic and abstract way, as if there were no differences within it. It is not the human being as such that has caused the current crisis, but a precise way of organizing both the relationship of humans with non-humans and the relationship between humans. The so-called Anthropocene has its roots in the social and economic formation of capitalism, in the capitalist way of structuring relations between humans according to the accumulation of profit, and at the same time in the way of organizing the exchange with the environment aimed at the massive extraction of resources needed to achieve this accumulation. For this reason, our approach converges with the fundamental assumption of the research developed by Jason W. Moore, who in many contributions has underlined the capitalist substrate of the ecological crisis. Below the Anthropocene, we always find the so-called Capitalocene. Consequently, the first task of a philosophy aware of the historically determined nature of the phenomena mentioned above is to develop a critique of the political ecology of capitalism, and no longer just a critique of political economy, as in Marx. It is therefore necessary to criticize, on the one hand, the Capitalocene from the point of view of the material processes that it deploys, and on the other hand, the ideological assumptions that are not only inadequate, but also are actually a constitutive part of the problem. We believe that the ecological crisis, in short, highlights in all its evidence how the transcendental exercise of thought can play a decisive role, translating itself into a real political stance. However, this certainly does not mean trying to restore the paradigm of the engaged philosopher that has often characterized the relationship between thought and political intervention during the 20th century. We do not want in any way to restore the ideological welding between philosophy and militancy typical of the 20th century, which today appears to us in all its limitations. On the contrary, a transcendental philosophy aware of its role in contemporaneity can be politically productive only by expressing its critical potential, that is, by acknowledging to the philosophical moment its necessary autonomy. By preserving its autonomy, philosophy can develop a critique of the assumptions of the dominant discourse and at the same time create concepts in order to open up alternatives. Regarding this last point, it is necessary to lay the foundations for a different way of conceiving politics, overcoming the logic of modern political science still prevailing during the 20th century. In fact, the logic and concepts of political science and political philosophy of modernity, based on the idea of the sovereignty of the state as the exclusive holder of political legitimacy, and on the neutralization of the political nature of everything that comes out of the mechanism of representation, this logic reveals more and more its obsolescence. First of all, modern political science is anachronistic with respect to the ecological crisis and the dynamics triggered by it, which exceed the territorial delimitation of nation states, such as climate change, pandemic waves, migration flows, energy dependence. Secondly, the same logical conceptual assumptions of political modernity proved to be part of the mechanism of power, exploitation, and appropriation lying at the basis of the so-called metabolic rift of the balance in the relationship between human beings and environment produced by capitalism. A fracture analyzed, for example, by John Bellamy Foster, Brett Clark, and Richard York in The Ecological Rift, Capitalism's War on the Earth. Finally, continuing to assume the political concepts of modernity fails to acknowledge the untapped political significance of the new processes and movements that have taken place in recent years. In recent years, in fact, we have observed the spread of an ecologism that is new in many respects, which in our opinion still needs a philosophical political lexicon capable of assessing both its radicality and its complexity. Our aim in this regard is precisely to offer a theoretical contribution that can shed light on the new forms of agency, revealing the peculiar political dynamics that characterize contemporaneity. Well, when we talk about a new ecologism, we are not only referring to movements like Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion. Certainly, we are close to the demands of these movements, and we believe that these mobilizations represent an indispensable element to transform the status quo. However, our thesis concerns a growing set of practices and struggles from which an alternative political direction emerges, both with respect to modern and 20th century politics and to some, albeit relevant, forms of mobilization and ecological activism. We believe that these new practices can be adequately understood in their novelty and recognized in their radically political nature, precisely moving from the concept of jurisprudence, or rather, from the idea of politics as jurisprudence. In the philosophical field, the concept of jurisprudence has been used by Gilles Deleuze in order to outline a way of conceiving politics alternative to the one linked to the idea of representation and the law conceived exclusively as an internal component of the state and its articulations. On the contrary, with the concept of jurisprudence, Deleuze was referring to a politics of cases and disputes, which obviously does not misrecognize the relevance of institutional actors, but nevertheless assumes them as part of a plural and composite, variable and contingent field of forces within which multiple relationships and new alliances are articulated and developed. Our goal has been to develop Deleuze's thinking on jurisprudential politics by highlighting that processes of politicization are no longer realized on the basis of modern legitimation and representation, but are produced through the interference between the institutional plan of courts and tribunals and the concrete context in which disputes and mobilizations are activated. In order to understand this crucial point, I will provide 3 examples that allow us to understand how the ecological challenge cannot be reduced to summits, proclamations, and international conferences, but is played out at the level of punctual political interventions that involve, on the one hand, contextual forms of alliance and self-organization, committees, associations, movements, aimed at local disputes, and on the other hand, sentences, pronouncements, judgments, and rulings expressed by the courts of justice of every order and degree. 3 examples of 3 different cases. First, the Urgenda case. The Urgenda case represents the first case that ended after a long court case that lasted from 2013 to 2019 with the final conviction of a state. The case began in 2013 with an appeal filed by the environmental association Urgenda to the Territorial Court of The Hague. The appeal asked the courts to force the state authorities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, or at least by 25% by 2020. The Supreme Court upheld the conviction of the state by referring to the obligations established by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, taken from the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, UNFCCC, to which the Netherlands adheres. Second example, the Shell case. With the ruling dated May 26, 2021, the Dutch Hague District Court upheld the appeal filed by environmental associations, non-governmental organizations, and more than 17,000 citizens, and ordered Shell to reduce carbon dioxide emissions of 45% by 2030 from 2019 levels. The claimants argued that Shell had breached its duty of care under the Dutch Civil Code and breached Article 2, right to life, and Article 8, right to private family life and home, of the European Convention on Human Rights. This was the first time that the court has ordered the company to align its corporate policy with the carbon dioxide emissions reduction targets under the Paris Agreement. Finally, the Affaire du siècle. On October 14, 2021, the Administrative Court of Paris condemned the French state for its inaction in the fight against climate change, ordering it to take all necessary measures to repair by December 31, 2022, the ecological damage caused by the exceeding of carbon budgets between 2015 and 2018. The decision came after 3 years of mobilization and legal proceedings by the promoters of the so-called Affaire du siècle. Notre Affaire à Tout, Fondation Nicolas Hulot, Oxfam France, and Greenpeace France, as well as more than 2 million signatories. The cases I've just listed are just a few examples of the conflicts known as climate litigations that are rapidly spreading around the world in recent years. In 2017, climate litigations were 884 and involved 24 countries. In 2020, they are 1,550 and involve 28 countries, including the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, France, Pakistan, Colombia, etc. When we speak of the collective exercise of jurisprudence as a new practice of ecological struggle, we are referring precisely to this overwhelming process that we believe is destined to grow exponentially. I will now attempt to thematize what this political process consists of from a philosophical political perspective. Politics as jurisprudence seems to have two main characteristics. First of all, the decisive importance of the more or less temporary and more or less organic constitution of contextual forms of alliance. Secondly, the increasing prominence of courts, tribunals, and their rulings as key players in political processes. Both of these factors have innumerable elements of specificity and difference from the logic of modern 20th century politics. With regard to the first point, in the perspective of jurisprudential political processes, the ability to form networks of alliances proves crucial, although these do not take place under the banner of an identity connotation based on belonging to a shared ideology. On the contrary, these alliances are based on claims and aims inextricably linked to the context and circumstances in the name of which the political mobilization takes place. For example, the construction of a high-speed rail line, the building of a waste disposal plant, the contamination of water caused by a petrochemical industry hub, for example, are the cases that provoke the claims that in turn produce the processes of political composition. As can be seen, a jurisprudential politics is not a politics of collective subjects, but of cases and contextual connections, contextual alliances. This means that the political process is no longer reduced to the organization on a national scale of communities that aspire to represent collective interests. Instead, it is about processes that take place primarily at the territorial level, Deleuze and Guattari would say molecular, moving from singular disputes in order to achieve concrete goals. This relevance attributed to cases is certainly at the basis of the precariousness of the movements under consideration. In fact, the contextual and circumstantial nature of the claims may prevent these alliances from lasting over time, supported by solid organizational forms, struggles, and mobilizations. In this regard, a weak point that, in my opinion, needs to be studied in depth concerns exactly this limitation linked to the problem of duration. In this sense, the time factor constitutes an essential theoretical and political issue insofar as it represents one of the major obstacles of politics as jurisprudence, and from another point of view, one of the most effective tools that interest groups can use to prevent any kind of change. This weakness, however, is at least partially offset by the second feature previously mentioned, the increasing prominence of courts, tribunals, and rulings. If we carefully consider the cases I mentioned earlier, such as the Shell case, we can see a fact of fundamental importance. Associations, movements, and ecological committees have not mobilized to raise awareness in the media in an attempt to condition the actions of governments, but then from the beginning called into question the role of the courts as crucial political players. In such cases, the function of law no longer occupies the same position established by the modern legal political system, according to which law must be conceived, first of all, as an internal component of the state's competencies, as happens with the legislative power of parliament. On the contrary, we are in the presence of a political involvement of the courts of justice by the movements, which in this way realize politics as a collective exercise of jurisprudence. All this does not mean denying or neglecting the political relevance of the institutional components, but highlighting that these components no longer fulfill their traditional role. Rather, the juridical institutional level represented, for example, by the courts, is grafted onto a horizon of contestation and negotiation of political arrangements, often converging with the conflicts which, although no longer represented by traditional collective political subjects, such as parties, nevertheless act and produce far-reaching political effects. I would like to conclude this talk from an important essay by Professor Gaetano Rametta, namely from the appendix on politics and jurisprudence contained in Deleuze's Interpreter of Hume. In fact, I think this quote effectively expresses the sense of my discussion of politics as jurisprudence that we employ to understand the new ecological struggles. I read the quote, "The concept of jurisprudence aims to bring the forms and practices of political experience in a further dimension than the one that has characterized the modern state, leading the law to its political root in a multiplicity of collectively shared practices, and at the same time helping to destructure the institutional stratifications that find in the state their field of consolidation and organization. In this sense, jurisprudence coincides with the execution of a law no longer bound to the legal stratification in a complex of laws, understood as the universally valid expression of the general will. It is not a matter of a jurisprudence without law, but rather of a law that in the multiple practice of jurisprudential production returns to approach the concreteness of the singular case and is therefore freed from its determination in the universal form of the law. Let me thank you for your attention. I have written two links. The first is the link of our website, the website of Metamorphosis of the Transcendental. The second one is the link of our manifesto that I know that you have already read. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.